the Japanese, we have a real possibility of reducing the intellectual property theft, reducing the incidence of joint technology, forced technology transfer, of state-owned enterprises dumping things into our own economy, precisely the sorts of objectives I know the administration has. So do you agree that the United States moving forward has to prioritize a trade dialogue with the EU in order to eliminate current retaliatory tariffs on farmers and manufacturers in places like Indiana, as well as to effectively combat China's nefarious activities?
Yes, don't forget Kansas farmers too. I don't have the benefit of having seen the press conference. I was sitting here. I didn't see the announcement or what they said. I know this was one of the things that President Trump was trying to accomplish in his conversations with Mr. Juncker. It sounds like they made at least some progress in that regard. Look, the president has been clear with respect to trade policy. Europeans won't accept our agriculture products. There are other markets that are close to us. He is endeavoring to get them opened. He is trying to drive towards 0, 0, 0, right? Zero tariffs, zero non-tariff barriers, zero subsidies. That's the place he's trying to get the whole world, and he is confident that when we get there, Americans will outcompete the rest of the world. And whether it's manufacturers or innovators or farmers or all of the above, they'll ultimately be very successful, and there'll be enormous wealth creation, not only in the States, but elsewhere.
Well, I'll just add that I find this effort of working cooperatively with the EU and other major economies as coherent and workable if we're trying to really address the greatest challenges, which is those seen by the state capitalist countries, China being the worst offender. I don't have as much clarity with respect to our trade strategy as I'd like to. It's one of the reasons that I keep emphasizing I think we need to actually have a written one, just as we do a national security strategy. But very appreciative of President Trump's announcement today. Lastly, Mr. Secretary, I'd like to call to your attention that my home state of Indiana is home to 23,000 Burmese Americans. And as I travel the state and listen to so many of my constituents that are Burmese Americans, they reiterate to me three things. Number one, they express grave concern regarding the Burmese military's atrocities against the Rohingya, and they want to see those perpetrators brought to justice. Number two, they reiterate a desire to expand people-to-people ties between Burma and the United States. And thirdly, they express concern regarding the treatment of Chin Christians in Burma. Now, I note that you're hosting this week the Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom focused on combating religious persecution and discrimination. And as we appropriately address within that forum the Rohingya crisis, I just ask the department to continue to also make clear to the Burmese government that all religious minorities, including Christians, should be respected. So, Mr. Secretary, will the Department of State work with my office to not only continue our joint efforts related to the Rohingya, which I support, but also to encourage the Burmese government to end any policies whatsoever that treat Christians as second-class citizens?
Yes, Senator, we will.
Thank you.
Senator Murphy. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I certainly associate myself with many of the comments by the chairman. I think we've got an administration, a president who's making up foreign policy on a day-by-day basis. I think you've got a tiger by the tail. You have a difficult and enviable job, and I appreciate you spending so much time with us here this morning. We focus on words from the president because our allies and our adversaries listen to those words and they calibrate their actions based upon those words. And well, you're right that the president, about 20 to 30 hours later, did correct himself after the Helsinki summit to say that he did indeed agree with U.S. intelligence services and not with Putin. 5 days later, he went back on Twitter and said this. So President Obama knew about Russia before the election. Why didn't he do something about it? Why didn't he tell our campaign? Because it is all a big hoax. That's why. So that's the most recent statement from the president, saying that Russia's interference in the election is all a big hoax. So I guess my question is, why shouldn't we accept this most recent statement from the president as U.S. policy rather than the statement that you referenced on July 17th?
Senator, I can't go through the litany of all the statements you just gave. I have a list from January 17, June 17, July 17, July again, July and 17, November 17, March 17. I'm happy to go through them, each of which the president confirmed that he understood that Russia had meddled in the election, and then I could give you, although I couldn't recount them, I could tell you numbers of times when I was personally with him where he told me directly he understood that. And indeed, provided guidance to, at this time it was the intelligence community, but I think he gave similar guidance throughout the government that we needed to do all we could to push back on election interference, and I have a catalog of activities that this administration has undertaken to do just that.
So then what do you make of his most recent statement?
Then I'll leave you. You can speculate. You can draw whatever inferences you want for whatever purposes you so choose. Here's what I can tell you. I can tell our allies.
There's no inference. I mean, it's a statement from the president in which he says that the Russian interference in the U.S. election is a hoax from July 22nd. There's no inference that I need to draw from that. That's the president's statement.
Senator, you are certainly trying to draw inferences about the American policy, and I am laying out for you American policy. And I'm happy. Let me talk to you about what we've done on election interference, if I might.
I understand. I understand that you draw a distinction between the president's comments and U.S. policy. What I'm trying to suggest to you is that what the president says is U.S. policy because our allies and our adversaries make decisions based upon those comments. And so let me try to drill down on a specific issue that Senator Corker raised, and that's the comments the president made regarding our potential defense or non-defense of Montenegro. Tucker Carlson asked him a question suggesting that Montenegro is too small to be defended, and the president responded by saying, I understand what you're saying. I've asked the same question. Montenegro is a tiny country with very strong people. Now, I know you are going to tell me today that the official policy of the United States is to defend Montenegro and to defend our NATO allies. But can you understand why we would be concerned that the president would draw a question as to whether we would defend Montenegro? Because in the end, that is a communication to Vladimir Putin about whether the president is going to come to NATO's defense. As you know, an attack on NATO won't be a Russian army moving across a border. It'll be a hybrid attack, a disguised attack. There will be some question as to whether the United States should respond or not. So can you at least understand why we are concerned about the president raising questions about the utility of the United States defending Montenegro?
So I think the president's been unambiguously clear, and I can go read you his policies. And if
I know, but you're going to refer to his policies or the separate statements. I'm asking you about this statement.
Senator, because
explain it to us.
Senator,
what did he mean?
Senator, the policies are themselves statements as well. Indeed, they're the most important statements that the administration makes.
Well, policies are statements and statements are policies. It goes both ways.
No, that's not true. That's absolutely not true. I make lots of statements. They're not U.S. policy. The president says things, right? The president makes comments in certain places. We have the National Security Council. We meet. We lay out strategies. We develop policies, right? The president then sets the course.
How do I know the difference between a presidential statement that is not a policy and a statement that is?
Senator, here's what you should look at. Compare the following: Barack Obama speaking tough on Russia and doing nothing. Those
not
were
true.
It is true.
I understand you want to rewrite the Obama policy on Russia, but that's simply not true.
Let's
organized all of Europe and all of the world.
Let's go task for task.
To put a comprehensive, unprecedented set of sanctions on Russia. So
the man said he would have more flexibility after.
I'm not listening. My question isn't about. I know you want to turn constantly.
I just want to look at facts and policy, Senator. I'm trying to get to U.S. policy. It's what I do. I'm America's chief diplomat implementing U.S. policy.
I think you have been dealt a tough hand. You do a credible job with it. Let me turn. Let me ask a less adversarial question to end with. I think one of you said two very important things on North Korea. you said that they have agreed to denuclearize and that they understand our definition of denuclearization.
Correct.
What is most important is that those two statements is that they have agreed to denuclearize according to our definition of denuclearization. Is that your testimony today?
The definition was set forward, and denuclearization was agreed to. I don't know what else to.
I'm not trying to give you a hard time. I'm just trying to understand.
I'm trying to articulate what's been agreed to. We made clear what we viewed as the scope of denuclearization is not dissimilar to what how the UN has characterized and how the South Koreans have characterized it. And when we did that, the North Koreans said, yes, we agreed to denuclearize.
So your understanding is their commitment is upon our definition?
Yeah, it is, Senator. Yeah.
Or turn to Senator Isaacson. So in essence, the communique that we saw coming out of the Singapore meeting, that is the sum total of the agreement we have with them.
Yes. We've also had conversations after that. It is also the case that agreement incorporated the Panmunjom Declaration, which in turn incorporated previous inter-Korean agreements as well. So the Singapore summit is stacked on a series of agreements, each of which is encompassed within the agreement between President Trump and Chairman Kim. So you can look to the full breadth and scope of those agreements about things the North Koreans have committed to.
Yeah, and look, I don't think any of us would expect that there would be a meeting in Singapore and all the issues would be worked out. I think we all understand it takes a long time to get this all worked out. Senator Isaacson.
I spent all week trying to come up with intuitive, brilliant, incisive questions to ask you, recognizing how intelligent and articulate you are, and I ran out of everything except one thing. I had it written down here to be the first question I'd ask you, and then by golly, the President of the EU had an agreement while we're sitting in here listening to this that answered my question, but I want to repeat it anyway. Are you seeing consequences of the trade proposals of the President's, particularly the 232 and the tariffs being applied, having any impact diplomatically on the United States of America?
Yes.
I do too, and the reason I brought it up is this. Actions have consequences, and I hope the administration will look to the State Department for insight and advice on the effects of the tariffs on the diplomacy of the United States of America vis-a-vis the rest of the world, because it has a significant impact, because ag is the number one thing upon which we're going to get levied the punitive tariffs by the people we're trying to raise tariffs on now. We feed the world. We're the food world's breadbasket. This committee's passed Feed the Future legislation a year time ago, but we're going to be in deep trouble if we don't have a policy that recognizes both our responsibility and the world's need and food's importance in peace and security. So, not to lecture you, because I wouldn't do that to me. You know more than you've forgotten more than I know, but I do know that the President's proposals and the tariffs are serious business, and he needs to consider the consequences on the diplomacy of the United States and hunger in the world. So I'll let you respond to that.
No, I think the President appreciates that. I think he understands that the tariffs that have been imposed have a diplomatic effect. They're part of my broader effort to be sure. Some of those things create difficulties. Some of those things create real opportunities. We've seen each from the sanctions that have been levied to date. And I know President Trump, it sounds like he made some progress today with the EU. I've watched Secretary Mnuchin, Bob Lighthizer, and the team try to use the effect of those tariffs to achieve good outcomes so that farmers can have access to markets, so that we get energy sold to countries that refuse to take our energy. Each of those things are important parts of the President's agenda to try and create wealth for ordinary Americans.
I commend the administration's commitment to 000 being the goal as far as the trade policy is concerned. But getting to that goal is going to require good communication between all facets of our government, including yourself and the State Department.
Yes, sir.
And the impacts, and that was the point I was trying to make.
Yes, sir.
I also am sorry Senator Paul left, because I was going to begin my remarks by saying I agreed with him on something, and I don't always do that. So y'all want to need to tell him that I preface my remark. But he is right about not being afraid of meeting with Vladimir Putin and the Russians and meetings with these people, in my judgment, are not as bad as a lot of people have pressed them to be. I've seen some people say we ought to back up from meeting with them, but I think the more open we can be in meeting with the leadership of countries we're having to deal with one way or another, the more it forces them to be open. So it's really, what the president has done when he went to North Korea, is all of a sudden Kim Jong-un was sitting on the other side of the table and said, I'm sitting across the table from the President of the United States, the world media is here and they're looking to me for answers. And all of a sudden after it's all over and the pomp and circumstance is all over, North Korea's got to be accountable or it's going to have pressure to be accountable. I think the president's engaging these leaders makes an awful lot of sense in terms of bringing them out and the feelings that we have with them. I just wanted to throw that in there because I think it's an important thing. Lastly, on bipartisanship, Senator Coons is here, who, by the way, had a significant role in your getting confirmed, as you know, and you and I have talked about that. I'm proud of my friend Chris Coons, and I'm proud of you, and you're a great choice for Secretary of State. But he and I have worked together on State Department issues and trade issues and tariff issues on behalf of poultry in the United States of America, particularly with the South Africans, who we cracked down the door here 2 years ago, and now we're getting 19 million in Delaware and Georgia sold to the South Americans who love them and are eating them. And it pointed out to me once again to reinforce what I did in my first statement about ag. We have such a powerful force with our agricultural productivity and the levels to which we've taken in our technology in agriculture. We need to use that as a tool for our relationships around the world. And I know you want to do that and want to be a part of that. You can help us in doing that because every time we make a trade deal that sells Georgia chickens to Delaware chickens to the South Africans, is good for Georgia and Delaware, but it's good for America too. Amen. Yeah. Thank you for your service to the country. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure if Senator Coons wanted you to advertise that again. I'm sure a social media account will have a lot of incoming and explaining, but with that, Senator Coons, I'm thankful for the role you played.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I was grateful for an opportunity to just show a little courtesy to a dear friend, Senator Isaacson, in that previous incident you're referring. And I will, at the risk of not being as gracious as I should be, just share that when Senator Isaacson and I met with the South African minister, that meeting was to hear their concerns about the impact of the steel tariffs on a very important alliance. Chairman Corker and I recently were in Sweden and had a chance to hear from them about their concerns about the steel tariffs. I am encouraged by the announcement that's just come out an hour ago about the meeting with the EU leadership, but remain very concerned that some of our closest allies around the world are getting the wrong message. In a dinner last night with the Canadian ambassador, a large bipartisan group of us were there to try and reassure them. I do think that we should be corralling our allies and partners in confronting China's aggressive, prolonged, and inappropriate trade actions and avoiding some of the needless harm we've caused to close alliances. The point of the South African meeting was that they are preparing countervailing tariffs that might well shut down our access to their market. But I'm not really here to talk about chickens, as much as I do love talking about chickens with my friend Senator Isaacson. Mr. Secretary, I just wanted to say first, thank you for this very long hearing. I want to confirm a number of senators have asked you pointed questions about progress with North Korea, with Russia, issues around Syria and Iran, and you've said not in this setting. Will you return soon to brief us in a classified setting, because there's a number of important and pressing things we really haven't been able to address today. Will you come back and give us that classified brief?
Of course.
Thank you.
Of course.
And a number of senators on both sides have recognized that you've got an important role in a very difficult time. I want to upfront just say I was pleased to hear about the Crimea Declaration. I think it's important for the administration to be forceful and clear about our position with regards to Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. I remember my whole childhood, there was a little box in every American map that said we refused to recognize the illegal annexation of the Baltic states by the Soviet Union in 1940. And for decades, folks thought that was just aspirational and would never happen. Today, the Baltic states are free. They are NATO allies. And the chairman and I recently visited Latvia as well and heard from them about their determination to remain free and to take strong steps against Russia's interference. Finland and Latvia, the Baltic states, other allies of ours in that region are prepared to invest more in their own defense. and to strengthen their defenses against Russian interference in their upcoming elections. There's elections in Latvia and Moldova and Sweden that are happening soon. What best practices are you seeing among our European allies? What tools do you think the State Department can and should be using? And how should we be doing, as you put it, everything we can to push back on likely election interference by Russia to our vital allies, as well as to our upcoming midterm elections?
Yeah, it's a good question. We, the United States government, my previous organization in the intelligence world, did a great deal of work with our European partners. We did with the German election, the French election, to help identify threats and vectors, good, solid intelligence sharing. I think that's an underpinning so that these governments can understand the threats. Sometimes America is better positioned to see them and observe them than some of these other countries that are smaller with fewer resources. And then I think it's also important, and we've begun to do this, that countries begin to share the actions that they observe. That is, not only the precursors or the indications, but what actually took place, to download so that we can begin to understand how to push back. I think it was Senator Paul who said earlier, there's lots of variations on the theme, right? There are overt efforts, there are, call them,
Covert efforts.
Covert efforts, there's influence operations, there are lots of methods by which adversaries, not just Russia, can attempt to undermine elections and democracies without obligation to the Europeans, and it benefits America as well if we try and help them ensure that their democracies are protected as well.
And I do think we would benefit from hearing more and more regularly and more clearly what we are doing with our close allies to convey that we get what is happening to them and that we are concerned about what's happening to us. Frankly, I want diplomacy to succeed. I prefer an environment of diplomacy to one of a perception of imminent conflict with either North Korea or Russia. And you've been very forceful, even aggressive today in advancing the administration's position. As the chairman said earlier, a lot of the tension here, I think, comes from the gaps between your forcefulness and clarity and what I perceive and many perceive to be the president's lack of forcefulness and clarity. In your written statement, you say that President Trump has stated, quote, "I accept our intelligence community's conclusion that Russia's meddling in the 2016 election took place." And you go on to say he has a complete and proper understanding of what happened. My concern, if I could just directly, is that our president has never made a clear and comprehensive speech outlining the threat posed by Russia, our strategy to respond to it, and criticizing directly President Putin for directing the attack on our election in 2016. Just a few days ago, now I guess more than a week ago, Robert Mueller delivered indictments against 12 Russian military intelligence officers, GRU officers, calls them out by name, gives enormous detail of how Russia attacked our 2016 election. And one of the ways in which our president then undermines the clarity and credibility of that action by our Department of Justice is by calling the Mueller investigation a rigged witch hunt, or by standing next to President Putin in Helsinki and suggesting he's uncertain whether our intelligence account of what happened in 2016 is the more credible or the Russian one. Could you please clarify for me, if there are clear indicators that Russia continues to interfere in our election planning up to this November, would you advise the president to rescind an invitation to Vladimir Putin to come and meet in the White House? Do you think it is unwise to extend the credibility and the prestige of a White House meeting without being clear about Putin's threat to our upcoming elections? Senator Paul said, and I agree with him, we should meet with our adversaries. But as President Reagan did, we need to be clear-eyed about who they are and call them out for being adversaries before sitting down with them. Can you commit to being clear with the president and helping us understand whether or not the president clearly understands the attack on our election?
So I've tried to do that earlier today, Senator Coons. I think the president is very clear about that. It is, I find it surprising that statements that are made, especially a statement like a statement for the record, I mean, you should all know the White House cleared that secret, right? These are White House, I uttered the words, these are President Trump's statements in that sense as well, right? These are statements from the United States government, of which President Trump is very clearly in charge, and somehow there's this effort to suggest that they're not that. the statements that I've made today are fully consistent with you, unless I misspoke somewhere along the way, which is possible after a couple hours. These are indeed the administration, President Trump's policies that we're implementing.
My core point, Mr. Secretary, was that while your statements have confused, our president's statements have confused our allies, encouraged our adversaries, and have failed to be comparably clear. And I'm concerned that an invitation to President Putin to the White House without clarity about his threats to our election, his threats to our allies, puts at risk clarity. I welcome the Crimea Declaration today. I think that is an important step forward. But I urge you, if President Putin attacks our next election, advise President Trump to withdraw any invitation to President Putin. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Portman.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for coming back to testify again. You've had a long afternoon. I think you ought to do it more often. I mean, while you've been here, we managed to negotiate a successful preliminary agreement with the European Union. You managed to issue a declaration supporting what many of us have been hoping to see with regard to Crimea. And there was a third thing that happened, and I don't know if it's good or bad, but my understanding is the White House has decided to postpone the visit of President Putin until after the first of the year.
That
When
doesn't
I left my
belong
business,
to
it
you.
began to succeed as well, so I'll come down here.
I think they wait until you're gone before they make all these decisions. No. I want to comment briefly on what you responded to with Senator Coons on what tools could we use with regard to pushing back on some of the interference in other countries' elections. I'd hope that you would say the Global Engagement Center, because it's a tool you have. And frankly, although Senator Murphy and I wrote legislation to give you the authority to do it, you have more aggressively used that tool, both by providing funding for it and now hiring the right people than your predecessors. And it's precisely this sort of situation. I will give you the recent example, very important, which is what's going on with Macedonia. You know, as they go for their referendum to be part of Europe, these European integration efforts tend to be a place where the Russians see an opportunity and engage in significant disinformation. Great opportunity for us to push back in the appropriate way through the Global Engagement Center. And would you confirm to me that you thought about that and you will think about that in the future?
Yes, of course. May I add one thing that I think you'll find interesting? When I was with my Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, he's very aware of the Global Engagement Center.
Should be. I mean,
he raised the issue with me.
Yeah.
When I met with him, I think it was when I met with him in person. It may have been in a conversation by phone, but in my last interaction with him, he raised the issue.
as compared to the resources the Russians put into their efforts, it is minuscule, as you know, but it is significant. And I think it'll be done professionally, thanks to some of the work you've done, and I applaud you for that. We discussed at your confirmation hearing in April the need for us to focus more on Central Eastern Europe, specifically Ukraine. I'd just come back from a trip to Ukraine. I'd been out in the contact line in April, where there's a hot conflict
All
going
this
on,
sneaking
and
about.
where there are people dying. And it is, when you go there, pretty moving, because you see how the Ukrainians have had to defend themselves and their territorial integrity really for the last 4 years against Russian aggression. And I believe, I think you do, that a successful pro-Western Ukraine is not only critical to the region, but I think it's the best antidote to Russian expansion in the region. Along those lines, I want to commend you for last week releasing the $200 million in military assistance. This goes for equipment, training, other assistance. And I think we have not taken enough credit for what happened, which is we told the Ukrainians, you need to make reforms. And when I was there in April, I talked to President Poroshenko. I also talked to Speaker Parubey then and again last month about this. In fact, I talked to them the day after they passed these reforms, saying, you know, we need to see these reforms to your defense system, frankly, getting away from the Russian influence system they had into one that's more consistent with European democracies, having a civilian control of their military, among other things. They did that. You then were able to release the $200 million. That's exactly how it should work, right? So I commend you for that, and I think it's going to make a huge difference. The lethal weapons they now have to defend themselves makes a huge difference. And so the actions sometimes do speak louder than the words, and in those cases, I think it's very important. On the resolution which you issued today with regard to Crimea, I was really happy to read it. I know that many in our community in Ohio who follow this closely are pleased with it. They believe this puts the United States clearly in the position where we will not relieve sanctions until this issue is resolved. And I would ask you today, can you confirm that the Russians have a clear understanding that sanctions related to Crimea will not be able to be reduced or certainly eliminated so long as Crimea remains an issue?
I think they did before this statement, and I'm confident after the statement that the President released, that will reaffirm their understanding.
Do you believe the Russians have a clear understanding that sanctions related to their actions in eastern Ukraine along the border cannot be altered without real implementation of the Minsk agreement and the end to that aggression?
I do.
There's a lot of talk about new sanctions, as you know, with regard to Russia.